Good afternoon. The topic of our discussion today concerns the theme of HR management in nuclear sphere. Everybody knows how important HR is, not only in nuclear industry, but everywhere. But today, we are going to talk about that. What we are aiming in terms of nuclear industry is peaceful use of nuclear industry, of course, because lots of people are so very precautious, are so very preconceived in terms of nuclear sphere, and they have some reasons for that, because the consequences, if something goes wrong, can be so very unpredictable and awful ones. General ideas of nuclear sphere can be described in different ways, but let's define some of them, okay? The first one is accelerating and enlarging the contribution of atomic energy for every sphere of human being living, yeah? Of course, we are talking about peace, health, and welfare. Of course, everybody has to benefit from nuclear energy, and to use nuclear technologies is a very important theme. And of course, we have to do it in terms of sustainable development. Actually, we'll go to this theme, but the next slide, okay? Of course, we need to advance nuclear science and technologies and to catalyze all those innovations, all those capacities, just to support existing and probably future or expanding use of nuclear engineering. I was talking about sustainable development. It's not just the simple one thing. Because sustainable development is the term that is widely spread and widely used everywhere. Why do we use it in terms of nuclear power engineering and nuclear power things, yes, such as nuclear fuel, waste management, and so on and so forth? Because the way we portray each other today is so very important in terms of our future generation. Because people who's gonna live after us shouldn't complain, shouldn't blame us in terms of we were not so very right, we were wrong in terms of overconsumption and so on and so forth. So it's so very important to deliver the existing prosperity to our future generation. And of course, nuclear power engineering can be extremely powerful in this term. Why are we talking about HR management in terms of nuclear power engineering? Why should it be in focus? Yeah? Why should we highlight especially HR? There can be lots of answers to this not so very simple question, but the most obvious one is just about workforce is the engine that supports every process everywhere. Yeah. So when we are talking about nuclear power engineering, we have to highlight HR, of course. That's why the essential theme of every process is HR. Yeah, and developing the relevant HR infrastructure to support all these workforce across the key objectives, across the key organization is a vital thing. Developing and integrating HR strategy, yeah, if we're talking about, of course, HR management, is a critical step towards building a competent and sustainable nuclear power program. And you can see that I highlight sustainable once again, because sustainable development is a crucial thing, of course. Nuclear power engineering presents specific challenges in terms of HR management strategy. Let's concern some of them. The first one is recruiting. The second one is hiring, the third one is training, and the fourth one is sustaining this great, qualified, skilled workforce. if we're talking about key elements of HR management strategy, we have to look precisely nicely to 4 of them. Let's begin, of course, with workforce planning. Then we can go to recruitment. Then the third one is education, training, and development. And of course, the fourth one is remuneration and retention things. Actually, on the another slide, you can see the items of HRM strategy, but in a very widen or very large scale, because before we just named 4 of key elements, and here we can talk about different items of them. Of course, we can begin with workforce planning. Why do we draw such an attention to workforce planning? Of course, everybody should know I'm talking about the organizations who are involved in the nuclear power engineering, and those organizations have to foresee what type of workforce is needed, what skills should they portray, when, why, and what should be performed in terms of workforce. So for doing all those things in the right way, you have to plan. So it's like the crucial element when you have a right number of people with the right skills in the right place and of course at the right time. So you can see 4 right things, and of course they should be done, implemented and applied in order everybody could gain from such a great approach. So the next step or the next key element in terms of HRM strategy after workforce planning is recruitment. If we're talking about recruitment, what should we emphasize is, of course, different specializations, specifications, different jobs, and so on and so forth. So we have to provide, our HR managers should provide a great workflow in terms of recruiting. Of course, it's a very hard job to be done, but it should be, of course. Then we are going to education, training, and development. It's a very complicated issue, and actually the complexity of this issue is connected with different reasons. Of course, the skills and the abilities that should be performed by this or that employee have to be on a very high level due to the complexity of the work that's going to be performed and implemented. So when we are talking about education, we are talking about training, those things should be highlighted in a very precise way. Of course, after you hire somebody, you have to contribute greatly in terms of his education, his training, and so on. And the 4th key element is about remuneration and retention. You know, the thing we are planning to in terms of remuneration is a key thing. Why can I talk about that in such a way? Because if we're talking about remuneration, it should be considered like 2 ways approach. On one hand, it can be like the salary, like bonuses, so it's like a direct financial thing, yeah? But there also can be indirect financial things. We are talking about different medical insurance, different compensation for food, for renting a car, for subsidizing the housing, and so on and so forth. And here we have to draw our attention to two key models. The first one is a motivation model, and the second one is the stimulation model. Both of them can be applied in terms of nuclear power plant engineering, but they can be mixed or they can be separately applied. Sometimes it's not a great thing just to mix them, cause it depends, of course, on the industry, but if we're talking about nuclear power plant engineering, and nuclear management as itself, maybe it's high time to think about motivation, not stimulating thing, due to the fact every employer in terms of motivation things should maintain a specific comfortable, extremely comfortable workplace for the employee. And you can imagine how hard it can be sometimes. That's why motivation model can be applied not for every industry. But if your employee is satisfied, if his needs are met, if all the requirements are made in time, everything will be okay. And if there can be any mistakes, and we know that mistakes in nuclear power engineering can cost extremely high, big money, So if those mistakes can be prevented, of course, it's not the fault of the employee, it's the fault of all the systems. So the employer has to think about organizing this workplace in a very careful way. So it should be comfortable, it should be safe, and it should be great for doing this or that job. Let's talk about different elements in terms of HR management strategy. We'd better talk about safety, security, and safeguards. Of course, in terms of nuclear power engineering, being safe and sound, obtaining great security is the key thing. We've already mentioned how pricey and how extremely terrible the consequences of those mistakes can be. So safety and security and all those guarantees should be highly prioritized. Then we can go to the competence requirements. It goes without saying that the requirements for the employees in terms of nuclear power engineering are very high. Not everyone can match them, so sometimes it can be extremely hard or even impossible mission just to provide the industry with high-skilled employees. And so these competence requirements should be met precisely, nicely, so that both sides of the process, on one hand we have an employee, on the other hand we have an employer, can have no misunderstandings in terms of that. Cause, of course, you can use, for example, stimulator model, and motivator model, those things I've mentioned already. You can pay lots of money, you can compensate different things, but if the requirements can be met, it will be a hard task to compensate all those things, and it will be a hard task just to make those competencies on a very high level. Another key element is fitness for duty. Strange, right? Strange as sounds, but it's okay with it, really. Fitness for duty, on one hand, you're talking about fitness, or you're in a gym or something like that. You're doing some gymnastics, you're performing some athletics, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we're talking about obligatory and mandatory things. Strange, right? But there are no problems with it. If we're talking about fitness for duty, we mean that every employee should meet some specific standards and regulations when hired. Especially, we are talking about medical examination. Yeah, when you're hired, you have to go to the doctor, yeah, and all those examination things should be done in a nice way, yeah, should be done correctly, so that no health problems can interfere with the work process in future. On the other hand, if we're talking about nuclear power engineering, we have to think about different ethical and drug tests. Yeah, every employee should deal with it. The third element in terms of fitness for duty is psychometric things. You know, sometimes it can be very stressful when things should be understood in a very short period of time, and when you have to decide whether or not something should be applied or done, of course you have to be ready for that. So those stressful tests should be applied as well. Let's go from fitness for duty to staff retention. Oh yeah, staff retention is a very specific thing. In terms of nuclear power engineering, it can be extremely specific due to the fact the lead time is so very long in terms of staff retention. Because you can imagine, for example, if we're talking about the countries who are performing nuclear power programs for the first time, they don't have proper staff to be hired. So they have to train, they have to educate those great guys who's gonna be their future employees. But right now, they don't have an opportunity to hire skillful and highly educated personnel in terms of existing or future nuclear power plant program. That's why it can be a problem. Yeah, Russia doesn't have such problems at all, because the educational system in terms of preparing such great staff for nuclear power engineering is highly developed. Yeah, but we are talking in general about different countries, and so it can be a problem. So the lead time from educational theme up to retirement can be very long. So bearing in mind the lead time is very long, we have to think thoroughly nicely about the staff retention, because it's like you are providing some sustainable life cycle of your employee. You are trying to nurse it just from the university or some vocational educational things up to his retirement. So yeah, it's very important. And then we can go to the knowledge management. You know, knowledge management is so very linked with the staff retention. Oh, I'm absolutely sure in it. Let me explain why I'm so very sure about that. Staff retention, as we have already mentioned, is a very serious problem, especially if you don't have an access to skilled employees. That's why you can hire somebody who's abroad, or you, in terms of working, yeah, on this for this plant power engineering industry, or maybe you can hire some maybe profs here, or just provide some training courses so that your employees can improve their skills. But of course, it's about time, money, and not every day you have such an opportunity. Yeah, it's very pricey. So knowledge management is dealing with this constant life cycle of retention of the workforce. So you have to provide this sustainability of the force. You have to look through the educational programs so that everything could be okay, then go to training programs and so on and so forth, just to save this great knowledge from one generation of workers to another generation of workers. Because just think, in average, nuclear power plant works for about 100 years, and you can count how many generations should be changed in terms of such a period of time. So the knowledge management is very important. On this slide, you can see different pipelines, vocational pipelines and educational pipelines, and how they are joined with each other in terms of getting a great employee so that our employer can be absolutely satisfied. This slide can show you precisely nice info. Just have a look. The next slide is about the total life cycle in terms of recruitment. We can begin with educational pipelines and vocational pipelines, then go to recruitment and onboarding, then go to training, developing, and qualification. And then you can see the last slide is about resignation, retirement, and internal movement. So it's like the last step that every employee has to take. Just a bit of it, you can see how many things should be taken in terms of our workforce planning, like the first stage of our life cycle in terms of HR management can be taken. There are 5 steps, so please just pay a bit of attention to it and spend just 2 or 3 minutes. The next slide is about durations of typical training programs. So induction, then we go to nuclear fundamentals things, then we go to plant system and process, and the fourth and the last stage is specific role. By the way, you can see the time is so very prolonged, beginning on the stage of introduction, or in the stage of induction from 2 weeks up to the role specific up to 6 years. So it's very prolonged, really. And a bit of risk management. There are 2 significant types of risks in terms of HR management strategy. And so the first one is program delays. And the second one is the potential lack of funding. It can happen, it can occur no matter what industry is dealing with such problems, but those 2 risks can be very important. So you have to think about them in order to mitigate them. The next slide is about potential impacts. If we're talking about risks, so let's draw a bit of our attention to potential impacts. The first one is reduction in the necessary workforce. The second one is departure of newly trained and qualified workers. Sometimes it can be like, somebody goes to have some trainings abroad, but won't come back. It's about retention policy. We've already talked about that. And of course, the third one is about difficulties. Difficulties in terms of recruitment of a nice staff that could be skilled, qualified, so that all the requirements can be met. Thank you for your attention.